Start off with, why does this exist? Why should somebody even consider making something like this?
So this is a really high efficiency, relatively high throughput with a relatively low energy cost to set this up. It's going to operate just with gravity and with time. It doesn't require electricity. It doesn't require pumping methods. It doesn't require forced pressure. It's just using gravity.
Is there a product on the market right now that could replace this for a similar cost, similar amount of effort?
The answer is yes and no. If you're getting into that, what you're going to end up doing is you end up really going to a forced pressure type method, or something that is very, very large, like a pool filter, for example.
Sure.
That's another example of forcing pressurized water through sand. But you end up, your economy of scale ends up changing, especially as far as the necessary energy to drive it.
Okay.
So on the market, as it stands, right like this, for a $250 system, which is what we purchased all these materials through via Amazon, actually, you can't really get into that range. There are different places you can reduce that cost by selecting different materials that we'll talk about during the material breakdown and the material listing. That being said, this offers an enormously high amount of output for what you're putting into it.
Okay, well, I think now is a good time. We should just get into the build, get all those details. I know everybody has a lot of questions. We're gonna go over in detail how to construct this, what materials, how to prep them, all of those things. And then we will also be providing links to the items as well, just to get you started. You can choose your own items, and a lot of these things you could find locally as well, but we'll give you Amazon links to basically go and purchase these things if you wanna do basically the same exact setup that we just did. So let's get started.
Absolutely. All right, so before we get started on everything here, we're just going to cover a couple of basic tools. Now, you don't necessarily need these exact tools, but these tools are going to make your life a lot easier when you're going through constructing this bucket filter system. So the first thing you're going to need is a drill. We do not recommend an impact, but you actually want a drill, preferably with a chuck, that you can chuck up one of these different bits in it. Two things that we'll recommend are a paddle bit set. We're going to want to drill holes between 5/8 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch. Simple measuring tape is going to be helpful. That's just going to help you kind of keep everything consistent, measure up from the bottom. Sharpies, you'll see us go ahead and mark the holes on the buckets where we're going to put things ahead of time. That just gives you a reference point, something easy to go off of. For what we're cutting with, we have a set of tin snips or shears. You can use trauma shears for this. We happen to be cutting some stainless steel mesh, but for window screen or anything else that you're using, you can use a standard pair of scissors or a knife. The other two things you're gonna see down in front here are painter's plastic. This is just really simple 3mm painter's plastic, or a contractor bag, a trash bag of some sort. So we're gonna use that for washing the media and storing the media when we're done. Everyone should be familiar with these as far as taps on coffee makers and decanters that you'll find in a restaurant or on the front of an Igloo water cooler. You need to make sure that you have a part on the back that has a rubber diaphragm or washer. The next thing that you're gonna see is this ceramic dome filter. So this is an optional stage, but we're gonna show you guys again during this video, brew bags. So these are very inexpensive bags. You can get them from a myriad of different sources, but the point is this is a bag that's used at home in your kitchen for brewing beer, brewing wine, but it fits inside a 5-gallon pail, a 5-gallon bucket. This is a 250 micron pore size bag, which is a really excellent size as far as being able to trap larger material. This is a stainless steel mesh. The stainless steel really resists the water corrosion and rust over time, so it's great to use. It's also a little stiffer than window screen, but standard window screen will work too, especially if you take that window screen and fold it over on itself. But this is what we're going to be using for this build in particular today. So the bottom layer, the last layer before it goes into either the ceramic or into your holding reservoir, is going to be granulated activated carbon. So in a lot of different water filtration systems, you'll see granulated active carbon or you'll see a carbon block. A carbon block is sintered, meaning using immense heat and pressure to turn it into one solid chunk. In this case, this is all granular. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a high quality granulated activated carbon, and this happens to be from Kolar Labs, which you can buy right off Amazon, and it's used for aquariums. So we're going to transition over to the sand. When you pick the sand, you want to use a high grade premium pool sand. Now, when you search for this, you can find this in your hardware stores. You can buy this right off of Amazon. Like I happen to get this Mystic White 2. You want it to be a number 20 silica pool sand. Do not use playground or sandbox sand. So we're going to transition from that to an optional stage. A lot of times you can go right to Pea Gravel, but because we are going through a fine to coarse, I like to use this Aquarium Rock. So this Aquarium Rock, just like the carbon, you can get at a pet supply or an aquarium supply store, but this is 1/16 of an inch to 1/8 inch rock. This is going to increase your amount of surface area in the filter, and it's going to give you a lot of interstitial space between the rock. This is Pea Gravel or your typical landscape rock. A lot of people are going to get wrapped up in, oh, should I get the Quickcrete or should I get the Sackcrete? It doesn't matter as far as the manufacturer. What does matter is the size. We want to be between a 1/4 inch and a 3/8 of an inch stone. If you do not pre-wash all the different silt, gravel, contaminant, sand off of this stuff before you put it into your filter, the first time you get your filter going, you're going to get very cloudy, silty water as you're washing all that contaminant off of it for the first time. All right, so we're going to cover buckets now. So there is a lot of flexibility you have in here, but there are a couple things to avoid. So these happen to be a food grade BPA free bucket that I bought in a 6-pack right off of Amazon. So these are a great bucket because they're nice and rigid. I don't have to worry about them being out of spec or out of tolerance. And they also come with these lids. So these lids have the locking feature on them, which absolutely for this is not necessary, but these are more rigid than your standard Lowe's or Home Depot type buckets. If it's not made out of HDPE, high density polyethylene, then you may have a chemical interaction that has happened inside that bucket that you don't want to drink out of. So if you had something in there like a paint thinner, an acetone, a mineral spirits, a petroleum product, antifreeze, oil, those are things that you don't ever want to use processed water through. So this is just an example we found right here. Seeing the staining and other petroleum product interacting with the bottom, this is a perfect example of a bucket that I do not want to use. That doesn't mean it's not usable, but that's one I'm not going to use. Another one is a paint bucket. You'll see these a lot at construction sites. You may have them in your garage, or if you went through a home renovation project. Don't process your drinking water through a paint bucket. All right, so we are going to start off with our media by a really important step, which is pre-washing all of this media. So the reason we do that is there's a concept that we refer to as the water tax. Now, the water tax developed out of a concept born at Darcy, Direct Action Resource Center, and that is how much water, how much time, how much resources is going to be required of you to bring this whole system online. And if you don't pre-wash this material, you build this filter up, you're going to notice that the first water that you have come through this is going to end up to be very cloudy, silty, or sediment filled. That's one of the reasons we're constructing this the way that we are, is to eliminate some of that sediment that's going to come through. But while we have the resources now, mostly the time and the water coming out of your garden hose, for example, I want to pay that tax up front in a way that it costs me the very least that it possibly can. So what you're going to see us do is you're going to see us work our way through this media, this material, from the bottom up in our construction process. So as we construct the system, as you're going to see us do, we're going to start with carbon at the bottom. The next we're going to go to sand, then we're going to go to the Aquarium Rock, then we're going to go to the Pea Gravel. Now, to make that easier on us as far as washing it manipulating it, drying it. We're gonna fill each one of our brew bags with that material before we start washing. As we start washing through that process, you're gonna see the water change as far as the gradient and the rinsate that's coming through. It's gonna start off being dark with the charcoal, and that's gonna get clearer and clearer and clearer. Don't get caught up in having to make this absolutely perfect. You just want to get the 80, 90% of that sediment out first. One of the things that you're gonna notice here as we pour this is the amount of, I'm gonna call it smoke, but that's all dust coming off the granulated activated charcoal. Now you're gonna wanna do this in a well-ventilated area, and you are not going to want to breathe this directly if at all possible. But as you see all of this come off, and you can look down here just as it's settling on the ground, this is all of the dust, this carbon dust that we're trying to get out of this before we put it in the filter system. Because even after this, we're still gonna say, make sure you put this through a quality gravity type, hollow tube type filter, whether that's a Life Straw, a Sawyer, a Grail, a Platypus, an MSR, whatever the flavor of it is, we don't wanna induce extra sediment into that filter if at all possible. So now we are going to preload the brew bag with our pool sand. And as you can see, this is a lot easier when you have two people to help preload this. Now you can use as much sand as you want. We advise 4 inches of sand as far as the height is concerned. So we're gonna start with about 3/4 of a bag, and we're gonna see how that sets in the bucket, and we'll add more if we need. So I'm just gonna transfer the Aquarium Rock into our brew bag now. Again, we suggest a minimum of 4 inches of media, of each type of media. This happens to be, I think, a 16-pound bag. I'm just gonna use everything because I have it. You can see the dust even coming off of this right here, that still, this has a considerable amount of sediment in it, despite the fact you can see it right there on my fingers. That's all stuff that I'm gonna try to do my best to get out of this before we put it into the actual system. So I have a sample of 3 different types of pea gravel here. This looks like either a crushed granite. You can see it's a little coarser around the edges. This one, you can see in particular, is all the sediment and sand on this. That's a perfect example of the stuff that I'm trying to get off of this, because I don't want to push that sediment further down into my filter if at all possible. That being said, as a juxtaposition, look at how nice and clean this Aquarium Rock is. Remember, this is part of that water tax. The material that I select here is going to require more or less work depending on what material I'm picking and where. The brand of this is not important. The important part is to get the size in that 1/4 inch to 3/8 of an inch size range. So for the demonstration purposes, I'm going to use this dirtier material to show you what the rinsate looks like when it's coming off very dirty, and then how that water will clear up as you pre-wash it. All right, so as we begin rinsing this, the one thing I'm going to caution everyone is against, the carbon happens to be light. The moment we get water in here, it's gonna get much heavier, and the same thing with the stone. Now, the tendency and the temptation is going to be to just smack this thing on the ground. If you do that, you run the risk of ripping your bag seam and dumping your material all over the ground. So I just caution everyone to be ginger and be, I wouldn't say delicate, but don't treat this thing like a sack of potatoes, because it will rip. So all I'm doing here is I'm just gonna wet down all of this and begin rinsing out this material. And the idea is that I want to get as much of this blackness out of the material before I press it to use. One of the important parts of doing this is going to be agitating the material. So after I've rinsed it for a little while, I'm going to set the bag down, I'm going to roll the material over, I'm going to remix everything up, and then I'm going to go back to repeating the same process. So just to demonstrate the difference that that makes as far as the pre-rinse, you can see already the difference in the clarity of water. Yeah, we still have some sediment coming out, but compared to the blackness that it was originally, this is the difference that you're making in rinsing as much of this material out as you can. And you can also see just how much faster it's clearing out. Like that first time, it took a lot longer to run clear. Now it's starting to run clear much faster. But we're still getting dirt, or we're still getting that dust, all that carbon dust out of the material. All right, so now that we've got this rinsed, we're gonna get ready to dry that material before we stow it. From that perspective, before you either put it back into your system, if you're actively going to be using it or drying it, it's important to have a nice clean area. Now that you've gone through the process of getting this all clean, you don't wanna go ahead and set this in the grass only to be picking up more material that you're gonna introduce into your filter. So we're just gonna set this over here while we continue to rinse our other material. So on this heavier material, like the sand and the rock, this is gonna be the temptation really to set this thing down hard. This is where I'm saying, don't do that at the risk of busting your bag out. So you can actually see how the bag is wanting to separate a little bit there. Now, a really easy way to deal with that is to double your bag up, just to make sure that you don't have a rupture. Nevertheless, we're gonna set it down over here next to our carbon and go on to our next media layer. We're gonna start off by washing this Aquarium Rock, which is the smaller 16th to 1/8 inch sand. And you can already see how we're getting some yellow rivulets out of here. So I'll pick this up as I rinse it to show you guys exactly what we are trying to get out of this material again. So you can actually see right down there in the water coming off, you can see the sand particles. Now, yeah, we're gonna have a layer of sand underneath this, but anything that we can do to avoid pushing more down into the depth of the filter, that's what we're gonna try to eliminate. There you go. And you can even see how now it's running much more clean after only a few gallons of water. So we're gonna set it down, we're gonna agitate it. And repeat. So we're gonna do the pea gravel here as the last layer. You can see the other 3 layers we have laid out already. And this one, just by looking at, is going to take a while to clean up. So purely for the demonstration, we're choosing the dirtiest one just to show you that it's going to take time, effort, and energy to get this stuff pre-washed out. But now is the time to do it instead of when you really need it. So as you see me agitate this stone, you can see where it's driving all that sediment to the bottom layer and where this bag is catching it. So what I might even try to do is see if I can spray some of that off without losing all my stone. And there's nothing special I'm doing here. If we lose a little bit, that's not the end of the world. But you can see the importance of agitating that and driving it down. You can see how it will gather on the outside of the bag. You can even see how it's gathering a bunch down here. So when there is stuff on the outside of the bag that is occluding what I'm seeing, I'm gonna come back and I'm just gonna kick that to try to drive some of that off. But we'll get a lot of this out when we actually dump the brew bag out and we actually put this out for drying, and that will be eliminating a lot of that. So you can see all this sediment that's gathering here that's come out. Now I'm clearing off my work area so that as I continue to wash this, I'm evaluating that rinsate. I'm evaluating what's coming through the bag to be able to see, hey, what the water quality is and then how much sediment is still pushing through. Like I spoke earlier, this is not a perfection process. You can spend all day doing this, or you can spend 30 minutes doing this. There's a happy medium between the two. The more time and care that you put into it now, the higher quality rinsate that you're gonna get through your entire filter. So you can already see just right here, from us putting a little bit of time, effort, and energy in, you're getting out a much, much clearer product, and you're getting much less sediment that's coming through the bag. So this is one of the great things about using the brew bags, is that you allow a lot of your sediment to get through. So as I pick this up and you look at the bottom, you can see where that sediment is collecting. So as we dump this out over there for the drying process, we're gonna be careful not to introduce everything back in. Also, as we dump everything out for the drying process, there's nothing saying that you can't come back over, open up your sprayer to be a nice even mist, and hit the top of your media trying to drive off as much as possible. All right, so we're gonna move this one over the stone. As I mentioned with the sand, I'm gonna pull over here. You can see the stretching on the seam of this bag right here. So it's just something you're gonna wanna be aware of, especially as you're moving the heavier materials. So as we lay all of these things out for the drying, as I said, we can come back and we can hit them with a little bit of water over the top. But ideally we want to do this on a sunny day. The reason we put the plastic down is so that we can A, see the water, which is really, really helpful, but B, we're also acting as a vapor barrier, and it's reflecting the energy of the sun, the light off the sun, back into the material, helping everything just drive through it and dry that material out as best as we can. To that effect, we also don't want to introduce all the stuff on the ground back into the media that we just washed. So we're gonna start right here, putting this together at the base level and work our way up. So the first two things that we're gonna put together are going to be our clean water reservoir that's going to collect water that's coming all the way through the filter, and the other one we're gonna set up is our settling bucket. So we're gonna set both of those two things up right now. So the first thing that we're gonna do is we're going to pick one bucket, and we're gonna come up about 2 inches off the bottom. And mark where you're gonna put your hole. Now, it's important to come about 2 inches up off the bottom of the bucket, because if anything does make it through the filter, we wanna make sure that it has an opportunity to settle out to the bottom. So when we do use our 3/4 inch paddle bit, now this is an important point to note, these happen to be the ones off Amazon, you can gauge the size paddle bit that you need based on looking at the overall outside diameter of the thread. So I chose 3/4 to work off of this. That being said, when I point on the point here, you can see there's about a little over an inch between the bottom, interior bottom of the bucket and where this is gonna end up. So I'm gonna go ahead and chuck this up and drill this right through the side. Make sure to spin your lock nut off the back, as well as removing your compression washer. Now this is an important point to make sure that this goes on the inside of the bucket. So you're gonna push this in from the outside and then on the inside, and I'm gonna twist this compression washer on. You're using that to create a seal between the inside wall of the bucket and that compression washer. So you can use your nut, pick up the threads, and spin it in until it's at least finger tight, and then look at the spigot on the outside. The reason I say until it's finger tight, if you start here, you're gonna have an issue. So make sure that it's straight, facing down, hold that in position, and then go ahead and crank down on that washer, flattening it against the wall of the bucket. Optional, if you are having a leak on this later on, you can come back with a wrench and put an adjustable wrench on this and tighten it down. We're gonna repeat that for our settling bucket for the exact same layout. Same process here. I've spun my lock washer and my sealing washer off. Spin that into place, while making sure my nozzle on the front is vertical. Now, one of the important points is by coming 2 inches off the bottom, when I am moving this around, this gives me the ability to stay clear and set it on the ground. If you drill this too far down, not only are you gonna potentially pick up any of the sediment that gathers in the bottom here, but then you might be hitting your spout against things. As you're taking this as clean water coming out of here, it's important not to be adding anything else to the front of this contamination-wise. So we have two of these buckets here. One is going to be our base layer, like we mentioned. The other is going to be our settling bucket. So going back to the settling bucket concept, we are going to save one of these lids that's going to be unaltered, and we're going to set this bucket aside. So if I'm bringing back water that's cloudy or has a lot of contaminant in it, before I put it into here, I'm going to let time and gravity do the work for me. So I'm going to decant this out of my container. So whether or not it's coming out of a larger tank, a 5-gallon jug, if it's really, really sediment heavy water, I'm going to dump it in here and I'm going to cover it. The reason we cover it is to keep from more things coming in, and we're just going to let it sit. We're going to let it sit for 12 hours, 24 hours, 36 hours. It depends on how much water you already have on hand, but the longer you allow this to sit, more gravity is going to pull all of that sediment along the bottom here. That means your filter system that you have set up as far as your buckets, but then your non-renewable resources as far as your Sawyer, your MSR, your platypus, your life straw, any of those type systems, or your other ceramic elements are going to have a longer life because you're introducing less and less sediment to them. As these buckets are getting stacked, what we're going to do is we're going to drill holes in the bottom of each of these buckets, but we also need to make sure that we have a hole in the top for that to come through. So as we continue to put this system together, I need to make sure that as water goes through one of these, it's able to go through this lid and into the bucket below. So one of the things that I like about these BPA lids, and these buckets in particular, is they have a nice thick rim, a nice thick collar around them. That acts to hold everything in place, especially when we have a lot of weight on this. So you'll see when I put this next bucket on here, it acts as a nice containment ring on here. When I start cutting this, I'm going to use between a 5 and a 6-inch hole in the top, and I'm going to slightly undersize my array of holes I'm drilling into the bottom there. So looking at this, between these two protrusions, I have about 6 inches here. So what I'll probably do is I'll come back up to here, mark and mark. That just gives me a reference point. I kind of have a little bit of a guide for how I'm going to cut this top. This is a note to be careful. Please be cautious as you go into the lid here. Now you'll see that I'm cutting on top of this bucket. It's just to help support the rim here, and so that you're not driving your knife into concrete or your material underneath. So one of the important points to note when you're doing this is that you don't want to get too close to the edge. You want to make sure that you have enough for your water to drain through, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you have enough structural support to bear the weight of the rest of the filter that is sitting on top of it. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to take this and we're going to repeat this for multiple different layers. So we're going to have our carbon, we're going to have our sand, and then we're going to have our gravel. So we're going to have 1, 2, 3. Now that we've finished cutting the 4 lids that we need, you can see we've got these all cut. What we're going to do is we're going to drill the matching holes that are going to be in the bottom of each bucket that are going to allow the water to pass through. So take your lids, set them off to the side, and then I would encourage you to take your bucket, your collection reservoir, your clean reservoir, with your spigot on it, and set that out of the way. And the reason I say that is every now and then, when we're doing this, someone ends up drilling a hole in the bottom of that bucket. That's not the place you want a hole. So, on the bottom of one of our buckets, we're gonna select it, we're gonna come up here, and we're gonna want to drill an array of holes. Now you can put 3 holes in here, you can put 4 holes in here. The important is you wanna put more than one in here in the event that one is getting clogged or one that gets blocked. So you're gonna put a couple of in here. I'm gonna choose 3 holes, just spaced at a pretty normal pattern around here. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna look at this and say, okay, 3 inches is gonna be about too small, so I'm gonna come here and do about a 4-inch diameter spread. So I can come to about there, we can come to about there. So those are my different locations that I can pit. Now you'll be able to see, based on the same 3/4 inch paddle bit that I'm using, that if I come pretty close to that, I'm gonna come pretty close to the edge. Now the important point to note here is why we did the 6-inch gap is that I wanna make sure that where both of these line up, I am inside that line. Someone's gonna say I didn't follow my pattern, but this was a guide more than anything. So I've got 3 holes there. Now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you why we cut that hole the way we did. So we wanna make sure that these holes are inset to the lid hole. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna repeat this on our other buckets. So the last one that we're gonna do is we're gonna put 2 holes instead of 3 holes in the bottom of the bucket. We're gonna use a different size paddle bit. That is for your optional ceramic filter stage. Now, this is an important point to note because when we are using these ceramic filters, we have the potential of them colliding. So looking at the difference, these are about 4 inches apart. So when I put these on here, I'm gonna wanna make sure that I take that into account and that I need at least 2 inches between these. So you can see when I set this up here, that if I set this here, I wanna make sure that it's not colliding with the side, but I also want to make sure they're not bumping into each other in the center. So as I see this here, I'm going to go at about 2.5 inches. So you'll notice on these again have a lock washer and they have a seal. And it's important to put that seal in on the inside so that you're not allowing contaminated water to bypass the filter. So you can see based on what I'm selecting there, for these filters, I'm looking at about 1/2 inch. So this is an important point to note with these filters is that those little extrusions on the bottom are gonna pop through the bottom of the bucket. So if you're going to choose to stack this off, you're gonna need to stack it on something else. So I'm gonna install on here my little rubber washer. I'm going to install my little washer and pass it through the bottom of the bucket. Now something to be aware of is that little plastic protrusion there is probably gonna get in the way. So what I'm gonna have to do is trim that guy off. On the inside. And lock washer goes on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I get that nice and tight so that I'm getting a good seal. And the reason we're using 2 of these, now you can use, like we showed in the other part of the video, you can use the candlestick type, you can use this type, but the important part is to use more than one in the event that one gets clogged or begins to fail so that you have another path for it. That being said, don't fall for the trap of thinking that you're getting a really high flow rate. There may be a bypass, so make sure that you don't have a leak that's bypassing your filters. That's one of the reasons you need to make sure that you get a really good bite from these filters as far as how tight you're making them. So I'm just inspecting my work here to make sure that I've got a good seal around the base. You can see how I've got space between the outside and between them, allowing water to pass through. And this might be very close on one of your lids. So again, make sure that wherever it sits, that you're getting clean passage between your filter elements going inside the lid that it's going to be sitting on. So this will be the bottommost component before going in to your bucket here. So we're just going to spin this guy over so I'm not damaging these by setting them on anything and just allowing them to rest here as we go into our carbon layer. So the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna just cut some of the simple stainless steel sheeting or screen to go in on the bottom. Now that's important just from the perspective of it's not critical to the system itself, but it does give you a layer that's preventing the bag from bulging and pushing through the opening and clogging it. So if you can imagine, one of those brew bags pushing through the bottom here. As it starts to push through, if it's not nice and tight along the bottom, it could end up occluding or clogging that pore hole. That's why we have 3 of these. So from a perspective of maintenance and ease of use, we're gonna cut a piece of screen and put that in the base. For this, we have stainless steel screen, but you can use any standard window screen for that. So as we're going through here, looking at our media and about to set it actually into our buckets, one of the things that we noticed is at the bottom of all of this rock in particular, you're going to actually see it get finer and finer all the way down to we're ending up with a lot of dirt and silt. Now this is exactly what we were working on washing out. So you can see how it pushed all of the fine material down to the bottom of the bag. That being said, because I have extra brew bags here, what I'm now doing is just moving stone without pouring all of it by hand over into another bag. That way I'm not inducing all of this little sand into the system. Now this little sand is, when you're doing your drying procedure, is something that you can actually work out of this bag. And I would suggest setting that bag that you've rinsed the material out aside. So we are going around that problem by moving the rock from one bag to a fresh bag without transferring all the little stuff with it. Now these are little tricks and tips that we're including deliberately to make this easier on you as far as having a system that can be set up, stored in your garage, ready to go without inducing more sediment and more frustration into your system. So the next piece that we're gonna do is we're gonna cut the screen to go in the bottom of these buckets. Like we just discussed, we don't wanna have that protrusion that's blocking the hole. That's why there are 3 in here in the event that one of these gets plugged. So we can use any different material to just keep that from happening. This happens to be some stainless steel screen that I got right off of Amazon. I got some of these tin snips to make it easier to cut. You can use trauma shears. Any standard window screen will actually work pretty well for this. I'm gonna make sure that I don't drop all the little metal shavings into the bucket here. This does not have to be perfect. We're just cutting a layer to give it a little bit of rigidity under the bag and prevent it from dropping through. Just make sure when you're cutting this that you know that your material is larger than the pattern of the holes that you have in the bottom of the bucket. So we're gonna drop that screen in on top of those holes. Once we have that screen in, we're gonna come back and we are going to select our media. Now we moved all of our media in from outside, but we kept it in these bags, and then you'll notice that we also kept it inside of a container. The reason we're trying to do that, again, is to limit the amount of contamination or other sediment that I'm introducing into the system. So I'm gonna take this whole bag and I'm going to neatly lower it into place while taking the outside of my bag and bringing it over the side. Now you might ask why we're bringing the bag over the side, and that is a really excellent question. If you leave the bag on top folded on itself, you are taking layers of material and you're creating a thicker section. As a result, that water will tend to want to pool on top of it and run off to the side, which is not what we want. We want the longest amount of material contact time as possible. So once we get this in here and we get the bag off to the side, we're gonna take this bag and we're just gonna rock it around a little bit. What we're doing is making sure there aren't any voids in there, and we're getting a nice even layer of carbon all the way across the top. So now that we have that done, we're gonna grab another one of our lids and we're just gonna stack this guy off to the side, putting our carbon up on top. Now we're on to our next layer. We're just gonna repeat that process by cutting a couple more pieces of this screen and laying it into the bottom of our other buckets before we begin placing our other media. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna place sand in here We're gonna put that aside and we're gonna start assembling the tower over here. Just that way, we're up off the ground as we continue to put more weight in this. It's just going to want to stay in one position. So we have this set up with the screens in the bottom of each. Now the two most important layers of this system are your carbon and are your sand. So if you are going to have more of one or the other, sand is the one that you're going to want the most of, carbon the second most, and then your stone, you can begin to reduce your thickness. So for this is the same sand that we just washed outside, the same process with the carbon. The more sand contact we have, the better. So what we're going to do is take our bag again, fold it over the edge, and we're just going to take our bucket and get everything shaken out. Now, one of the things that we don't want to see happen is we don't want to see the top layer of this get smashed to pieces, nor do we want this whole tower to be wiggly. So one of the things that we can do based on what we're seeing as it comes up is we can actually nestle one material inside another material. So this is a perfect example of where my sand sets. I can now take my aquarium rock, which again is not absolutely critical. However, it's a nice to have, and you can nestle this material right on top of your sand. This is just one more layer. You can see the sand that we talked about washing out outside. Same thing that we were just showing. And again, we're gonna nestle that nicely. So this makes this layer particularly heavy. However, it means that we don't have to go any higher. So we're gonna take this, we're gonna stack it off, and we're gonna begin putting this in place. So I'm just gonna take this one over. I'm gonna move my carbon off. And I'm gonna take my bucket here, because those are both empty. I'm gonna put these in place here. Now, if I lock these lids down, which I can do, we talked about this, what don't I wanna do? I don't wanna set this down on the ground because of those two protrusions. I don't have a lid there. So I can just add a lid. I can snap these lids down in place. In doing so, they're going to be much more rigid. However, they are not going to want to come off. So I was just seating that lid. So I'm going to use this guy, making sure these fall within. Go back here and seat these lids. Okay, so we're going to go carbon next. Now I can set this on the ground. Why can I set these on the ground, you might ask? Because these have a nice little lip here. That little lip, my water isn't going across. All of the area my water is touching is coming through these. So that's one of the reasons I like these buckets. They have a little better edge on the bottom. So again, you can see my 3 holes that are coming out of the carbon, and they're gonna drop in here. Now, before I do that, the rim of the ceramic element in here, it stands off from the bottom about 3/8 of an inch. So if you recall, in seeing how much black dust came off of this, I'm using the same power of settling, of time and of gravity. So as that water comes through, that heavier sediment is sinking down to the bottom and not clogging up those filters.
We can process approximately 5 gallons we can dump into the top of this thing.
Yep.
And then we start, running down our filter stack. But when we actually get to the bottom, how much water do we actually see come out of this at the bottom of the system?
To pre-wash all this material could be anywhere between 20 and 100 gallons, depending on what kind of material that we talk about. I want to make sure that I'm getting that water or that media as clean as possible, so that for the first time when I flip that spigot, that I don't have black silty water coming out of the base of it.
Sure.
This will not work for saltwater pools. For saltwater, we need to set that off to the side. That's a completely different discussion. But for typical chemical treated pool water, you can in fact run it through this. That being said, a trick for that is to have 2 clean containers that you can pour the water back and forth between before putting it through. What you're doing is you are allowing the chlorine to have access to the open atmosphere, and it boils off naturally. So that's what you're trying to do. So if I can boil some of that chlorine off naturally by pouring it back and forth between 2 containers until it doesn't smell as much, I'm saving that material.
Yeah, you're not using those pores to capture.
Correct.
To capture that. We're going through these layers. We're dumping water from some kind of container, and that water, as part of that water tax, it costs us retrieving the water potentially.
Yep.
And then any kind of pre-filtering that we might be doing.
Yep.
But really, the water tax for this is that 5 gallons in never equates to 5 gallons out.
Ever.
At the 1-to-1 ratio. I mean, I think when I built mine, I estimated about 40 to 50 gallons of fresh water is what we used to clean the media and get the media in a state where it could be used in this filter without just running a bunch of garbage through the filter and decreasing its effectiveness. What is a lifespan of something like this? And obviously there's a lot of variables, so I'm asking you kind of a loaded question because there's a lot of assumptions I could make about the clarity of the water going into the system. So let's say that we are dumping, let's say like a worst case scenario, we're dumping some pretty gnarly water. We have no means, or we don't have the time to pre-filter the water. So we're taking it out of a silty, kind of muddy source, and then we're dumping it straight into this. How long is this filter gonna last?
It depends. So you set those parameters pretty well. I would say even putting that in, you're going to get more than a couple 100 gallons out of this before you start to see a major change.
Okay.
And one of the easy ways that you can see that, particularly whether or not your activated carbon is still taking things out, is with food coloring. A simple couple drops of food coloring into the top when you pour in, if you are getting colored water out of the base, then you know that your activated carbon isn't stripping those organic chemicals out of the water, in which case you should stop. That being said, one of the things that we talk about at Darcy, we teach very deliberately at Tusk, is even in this methodology, we always recommend 2 forms of either filtration or treatment. You are always crossing one with another. So if I have really, really gnarly water, and it's coming out of a pond, it's Darcy water, and I know I'm in a no-fail situation, I am going to put it through this, then I'm gonna put it through my hollow tube type filter, whether that's a Life Straw, Sawyer, Platypus, MSR, Grail, whatever your flavor is, I'm gonna put it through that before I'm gonna end up hitting it with some sort of treatment.
Yeah.
Now the reason I'm doing that is I'm using this to soak up all of that gnarly, gross stuff before I introduce it into my non-renewable, limited filter type system.
We shouldn't just be putting our cup underneath the spigot down there, although you could if you had to. So, again, that whole the situation dictates. And I think it's important to note there are some additional steps that we should take with this, right? So we decided we needed water. Right? Only everything on the planet needs it basically to live. So we decided we needed water. We decided to take the initiative and build this. We bought the resources. We prepped it correctly. We practiced with it, which is an important one. We actually set it up and we used it. Now what? Now what should we do?
So dovetailing off of, or springboarding off of what you just said, set it up and use it. That's an important piece of this, to make sure that you understand how it works, where its weak points are. Could you have done better in the construction, or is there something that you want to change? This is not written in stone. It does need to make sure that you go through the appropriate media layers.
Sure.
But you need to make sure that those things happen.
Yeah.
So once you've broken all this down, like any of your water equipment, whether it's filters, whether it's containers, think about your Tupperware you use in the kitchen, or any of your utensils you use in the kitchen. You don't just put them back in the drawer after you're done with them. You clean them out, and then you make sure they're dry adequately before you put them away. So the same thing applies to this. Make sure that you get in here with clean water. I would highly suggest taking just hose water again, rinsing everything down, and then setting it out in the sun. So these buckets, let them sit out and air dry in the sun. UV sterilization is something that is still used. It is a very powerful tool. So get these things out and get them nice and dry. Get your brew bags out and on the plastic, like we showed laying it out, sift out all of that material, spread it out nice and flat, and let it set out there on a nice sunny day and get nice and hot and dry everything out. You're gonna have to go in there a little bit. You're gonna have to turn the material over, spread it out. Just make sure that you don't have any moisture trapped in it. From there, put it back in either your brew bags that you've cleaned off or even in fresh brew bags. From there, having something just like a contractor bag or a simple kitchen trash bag, once it's all dry, stow it inside that dry trash bag, knot it off, and slide it into one of your buckets. And that whole system then stacks with your media, with your the buckets, with your brew bags. So you have all that material in there. Bonus points if you take any of your chemical test strips, if you're going to use those, any of your food coloring, put that in a little baggie as well. If you have any other material that you're going to use with this, maybe like an H2Go or a family pack of life straws, any of that kind of stuff, stow that in your reservoir bucket or your settling bucket or any of these number of different things. So if you're going to go to the lengths of building this, I would highly suggest building 2 simultaneously. Sure. That way you have not only redundancy, but the fact that when people show up that you and I are not planning on potentially, but they have been planning on us, I don't want to put it in a perspective where I'm putting my family at risk. Yeah. And so that's part of why we talk about a no-fail situation or no-fail set of circumstances, that when I'm giving this water to my 2-year-old or to my 4-year-old, there's no cognitive recognition on their side to be like, hey, is this water clean? Yeah. And so putting it through something like this before going through my other steps, I do recognize, and someone will absolutely point out that this is, air quotes, overkill, or we're going to an extreme extent. And I recognize that. And the point of going to the extreme extent is to make sure that I'm handing off information to you that could potentially be life-saving. But in that situation, I want to make sure that there are safety factors deliberately built in to make sure you don't end up in that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, I mean, we've been through the whole process now, the theory of why we want to do it, how to build it, where to get the materials. So if you are interested, you should get out there, build yourself a bucket filter. If you already have one and it's different than ours, or if you have some clever way of processing water, then we don't know the answer to everything. So
please
comment on it, let us know. Maybe we'll have it, upgraded in a different video or something like that. If you find this information useful, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you next time.